one thing is sure, you don't have to travel far to see interesting things in Florida. Just hop in the car and travel to something new and something strange.
Florida, America's Riviera. Before becoming home to Mickey Mouse, the Sunshine State was home to mermaids and dancing dolphins. Families from across the nation headed south in station wagons, buses, and trains, seeking sun and exotic adventure, returning home with a lifetime of memories. This is the story of the legendary attractions of Florida, those that have faded into the past and those that continue to delight and entertain. For generations, Florida has meant vacation. Today, it is unparalleled as a tourist destination, attracting 50 million visitors each year. 1/3 of those are drawn to one place, Walt Disney World. But there was a time, not too long ago, when a Florida vacation meant something entirely different from what it means today. A vacation that was decidedly smaller, more personal, even a bit unusual.
The personality of the Miracle Strip could be summed up in one word that is overused a lot around here, but there is absolutely, positively no other word to describe it, and that is goofy.
Tim Hollis is a lifelong student of the quirky tourist spots that dotted the highways of the South.
Well, everybody likes goofy. You know, everyone likes something that is just so totally out of the ordinary that you wouldn't even think of seeing it back home in, say, Cedar Lakes, Iowa, or wherever. People want to see something that is totally different from home.
Florida wasn't always this way. The state was always different from home. Having joined the United States in 1845, Florida was slow to develop. Its largest city through the dawn of the 20th century was Key West. Those who traveled to Florida did so to hunt, fish, or recuperate.
Florida was seen by some Americans in the 19th century as a vast sanitarium, a place where the invalid and the consumptive-ridden Americans could come and rehabilitate themselves. During the Gilded Age, in the late 19th century, only the wealthiest Americans could afford to come to Florida. Working class Americans, industrial workers, had no conception of a vacation. A vacation is a post-1920s phenomenon in America. And a visit to Florida required often weeks and months of stay.
An explosion of development transformed Florida thanks to the work of two industrialists. Henry Bradley Plant owned a vast network of steamship lines and railroads. He used his fortune to develop Florida's Gulf Coast. Henry Morrison Flagler was a railroad magnate and partner of John D. Rockefeller's in Standard Oil. He developed Florida's East Coast, building luxury hotels from St. Augustine to Key West.
There's a wonderful rivalry, as there was with other robber barons. The most wonderful story has Plant inviting Henry Flagler to the opening of the Tampa Bay Hotel in 1891. And he wires him a telegram inviting him. And Flagler wires back with the question, "Where's Tampa?" And Plant replies, "Follow the crowd, Henry, follow the crowd."
Well, of course, when Florida first became a tourist destination, it was a destination for the very wealthy. That changed probably in the 20s when the automobile became affordable to the general public and people started going out on motor trips. The common people began coming to Florida, and the wealthy were forced to go somewhere else for their vacations because they didn't want to be hobnobbing with the hoi polloi.
At the end of World War I, Americans had time on their hands. They also had some money, but they had transportation. They also had roads now. If you were encountering Florida in 1930 and 1925, you had the Scenic Highlands route. You had the Orange Blossom Trail, the Old Spanish Trail, the Dixie Highway, the Tamiami Trail. These were wonderful routes that were just so scenic. With their Model Ts, the first, quote, tin can tourists arrived in Florida.
Florida welcomed these caravans of new visitors and gave them campgrounds with free water and electricity.
Later, cities soured upon these tourists because they realized that these were very stingy visitors. The joke was that they brought a $10 bill and 2 shirts and never changed either the entire time. But the tin can tourists usher in a new wave of tourism.
This new age of tourism sparked a new business, the roadside attraction.
Alligator farms, parrot jungles, cypress knee museums, all these date to the 1920s and the 1930s.
Of course, the primary aim of any roadside attraction is to separate tourists from their money. The first thing they had to do was find a location, and then they had to come up with something that would cause those people to put on those brakes and pull off of the road. Florida was just full of attractions that you really wouldn't see anywhere else. And a lot of them just capitalized on that whole idea that Florida was this tropical paradise with tropical birds and a lot of water. Each spring in Florida tried to develop its own unique selling point, like Silver Springs had its glass-bottom boats.
In the late 1870s, Silver Springs introduced its glass-bottom boats, making it Florida's first big attraction. Ulysses S. Grant and Thomas Edison were among those who traveled the St. Johns River to marvel at the spring's natural beauty. In the 1920s, thousands more were coming by car. Silver Springs was now the biggest tourist attraction in the American South.
My grandfather and my grandmother and their 2 children and their chimpanzee named Mary moved here in 1933 and bought this hammock that we are standing in.
We came down here in the early 30s. My husband was crazy about monkeys, but his folks never would let him have one. So I let him have a monkey, and that just started everything.
What Joe and Grace Dumond started would become Monkey Jungle, a place where the people are caged and monkeys run free.
They purchased 6 monkeys and released them in the hammock, hoping that they would colonize. And sure enough, a year later, the monkeys were still here, and they decided that this project was going to work. And people that were driving down into our area, known as the Redland, would come out to see the orange groves that were all surrounding this area.
People would see the monkeys out in the road and come in and ask about them.
And so my grandfather and my grandmother would take them on a tour and explain that they were trying to do this research project of studying the behavior of the monkeys.
And of course they'd go off and tell their friends. And it just grew that way.
Finally, in 1935, they just decided to open it to the public and charge a 10-cent admission.
The animals were aggressive, and we didn't want people to get bitten, so we caged the people instead of the monkeys.
The whole concept of having monkeys out in the wild was ahead of its time, and then caging in the people made it even more unique. It was featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not. You know, you'll never believe that people are in the cage.
Franz Scherer was living in Homestead, which is a town south of Miami, and he was running a feed store. And he had some birds in the feed store that people would come in and pay a lot of attention to him.
Joe Dumond of Monkey Jungle was a customer of Franz Scherer.
He'd come up and he would tell my husband, you ought to do this, you ought to do that. My husband said, look, go away, start your own jungle. So we had monkeys and they started with parrots.
In 1936, on the site of an old nudist colony, Franz Scherer opened Parrot Jungle.
When you walk around the area, everything just seems to blend in with the area. It looks like it just grew right out of the ground here. His idea was just to bring a few birds, but he grew to where he had 1,000 birds here. We had a great collection.
Richard Pope was the Pope of Florida tourism, an extraordinary figure. Born in Iowa, he comes to Florida in the 1920s with his father. And in the 1930s, he and his wife buy a plot of land on Lake Eloise in Winter Haven. And he creates Cypress Gardens, which serves as a wonderful transition between the old and the new tourist attractions.
Dick Pope was a publicist by trade. He used those promotional skills while creating Cypress Gardens.
When Dick Pope Sr. started building Cypress Gardens, he would use a viewfinder, you know, like a lens, and he'd look at it and he'd frame it up and make sure it was the right tree and everything was in the right spot when he'd do it. So when people walked in and stood in front of something, they'd say, well, that makes a beautiful picture. But he had already planned it years before, so that's where he had the vision.
Pope, above all, was a salesman. He had this wonderful piece of natural beauty, but he improved upon it.